So while I'm working on my previs, I sometimes like to take a break from it and start doing some look development already. So what do I mean by that? I just like to start messing around with shaders and with lighting and trying to get sort of a final result to see what I can do. Now I've got one of these previs files here, and the first thing that happens when I open it up is that it errors out a little bit. And I left this in on purpose because I wanted to show you something as well that sort of adds on to using library or using linked assets. So if I go and look at my outliner and go into the Blender file, one of the things, if I remove the cam here, one of the things that you can see is that my library here, the link has been broken as a red line through it. So usually what I'll do is just hit right click on it, hit relocate, and then let's see if we can find it here. Go to my assets and Blenderman import. Now this is again going to take a while because it's loading it in from the network, but this is the way you can relink some of those lost libraries. Let's say if you moved it around, you changed the directory, or you just did something stupid, or you renamed it or whatever, or you have to use a backup version and you want to replace it, then that's the way to do it. So as this loads in, hopefully it'll pop up in just a second. There we are, and we've got our final shot again. So if I were to render this now to start the look development, it's going to take a little bit because it's going to load in all those different assets. There we go, and it'll start rendering. So the main Blenderman scene is absolutely huge, and you can see there's a bunch of stuff going on here. I had an environment texture in here, so I'm gonna reset that in just a second to show you what happens. But one of the other things that I tend to do is, let's say if we look at the shot, we can see that only this portion is really being used. So what I like doing is hitting, first off, go back to our current scene, hitting the A key so nothing is selected, and then hitting the B key and dragging a box around our camera view. Now what this is going to do, if I go outside of the camera view, it's going to select a bunch of objects that are in view, and what I like to do as well is go to the end of my camera movement and do the same thing. So this means that I now have all the objects selected that I need for my camera movement that are in view. So what I can do now is just invert my selection, make sure there's nothing in there that I like my camera rig or whatever, and delete them out. And when I go back into my camera view, you'll see that the shot still looks exactly the same, but we've gotten rid of all the other assets. And if I were to hit render now, then the render starts instantly. Now I'm going to throw away everything I have here in my environment because we don't want to use that. And I want to start from scratch, so I'm going to set the strength to 1 and sort of set this back to default settings. There we go. So what do we have now when we start rendering? We just have the usual gray standard Blender background. So the first thing I do when I start look development is start messing around with lighting, and especially with HDRs. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to use the Blender Cloud add-on to pull a HDR from the cloud. Now it doesn't matter what you use. I'm actually going to save this file. There we go. Hit the Blender Cloud add-on, and I'm just going to grab a random one. Let's say this parking one, for example. So you can do this by just loading in an HDR manually. Doesn't really make a difference. So with that loaded in, if I hit Shift Z now, I like to be looking at my rendered view almost at all times to make sure that it looks correct. So one of the things that we're going to have to do is actually bring in our, where are we? Texture, environment texture. And because it's loaded in, I can just grab it here, stick it into the color slot, and there we go. So now we're lighting this with an HDR. Now, most of the time, most people, they load in an HDR and they're sort of done with it. And I don't necessarily agree with that, especially if you're doing these shots that are really up close. You can mess with the HDR quite a bit. Now I hit Control T to add in texture coordinates with the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, so I can start turning this around and seeing sort of where the lighting is coming from, seeing if I can get any highlights on my model. Turn around, and I like just turning around on all axes. Again, unless you have really highly reflective, like mirror, almost like shaders, you're not really going to see you know, if this is a parking structure that's upside down or not. So what I like about this is we're getting sort of nice shadows and nice contrast in here. I might boost up the strength a little bit. And if I'm feeling a little adventurous, I might throw in a gamma or a color correction or something like that in between. And a lot of people, you know, at this point would be like, well, he's messing up all the colors of the HDR, and, you know, what I'm doing isn't really physically correct and all that kind of stuff. But with motion graphics, you have, especially if you're working on these types of shots that are very close, that, you know, have a certain sort of look to them, I wouldn't worry about it too much. The only thing that might happen is if you mess with the colors or with the gamma too much of an HDR, you might get a little bit of noise and things that is a lot harder to eliminate. That being said, though, I don't really worry about that too much. I worry about getting things rendered when I get them rendered. Again, I think that if you're worrying about this kind of stuff too much in the beginning of your workflow, it limits your creativity, and you're not really thinking about what you want to do with the objects or with the scenes or with the look. So especially during look development, I don't really care how long things take to render. I just try them out and see what I can do with them. So that's it up. We've got a nice little baseline to start with here, and hopefully our color management hasn't been messed with. Okay, it hasn't, so that's good. So I can take you through the whole process. Now, one of the first things I do is try to actually add in some extra lighting as well, because just an HDR it's not a one-click solution. You can add extra stuff in, and I'll get these nice sort of highlights on the back of this object over here. So I'm going to switch to my 3D view. I'm going to have a look at my objects here, and with my 3D cursor, I'm just going to click there, and I'm going to add in an area lamp. Now, I like to use area lamps for the most because I think they give really nice results and really nice shadows, because of the fact that they automatically have sort of a size to them, and you can do some really, really cool things with them. So I tend to set the max bounces down a little bit just to speed things up, but generally it doesn't make that much of a difference unless you're using a lot of lights. So now I'm going to play with the strength a little bit. Let's say 2.5, something like that. And as you can see, we're getting a lot more contrast and a lot of really, really nice highlights in our image here. I'm going to move on a little bit. There we go. So we have a nice image to work with. And the cool thing about this is that now we can see what we're doing. We can iterate very quickly, can try stuff out very quickly. So this light might still be a little on the bright side. There we go. And if you wanted to, you could just hit Shift D, duplicate it, and put another one down here, rotate it around. And when you're first starting to do this, I know I see a lot of like students and things do this as well when I'm teaching, is people get so constrained to your X, Y, and Z axes, and it doesn't really matter. I mean, my camera's at a really weird angle over here anyway. Just try stuff out. Don't be afraid to mess around and, you know, sometimes break things, because you can always undo and try and fix things afterwards. So I'm going to bring this light down a little bit. There we go. Maybe bring the size down so we get slightly sharper. And we get slightly sharper shadows as well in here. Bring it up, rotate it, see what it does. And then we have, you know, our HDR and two other light sources, and we have this really nice lighting going on, which is really cool. So for the next part now, what I want to do is bring in some shaders. And generally, if I'm doing this kind of thing, I'm working with these linked objects. So I'm going to have to select one of these, select maybe some other ones. We'll just start with one, and I'm going to hit the L key and say I want to make local selected objects, data, and materials. So this means they're now objects in my scene. Keep in mind though, if you're updating your main BlenderMan scene, that this will now not update anymore. So generally you want to do this when you're sure that this is going to be your shot, or if you're just doing look development for fun, make sure you save it as a separate shot so you don't mess anything up yet. You can still always bring in the shaders and the lights and append them from the look dev file that you've created. So now I actually have my my shader in here, so I could create a new one. So I'm going to throw this one out, create a new shader, go back to my node editor, not the logic editor, but the node editor. There we go. And I'm going to set this to object, and now I have just a plain white shader. And so in my case, I believe I used a red color. So now I can actually see this thing light up. I'm not going to go through the entire process in this video. This is just to show you, don't forget to have a little bit of fun while you're working on this previs. You can already start messing around with things, and let's have a look and see if I can find the original look development. So I have an animation test here that I did a while back. And this is one of the very first shots that I tried to finish, and you see it's a lot slower than in the final video, but it gives you an idea of what I was doing and what I ended up creating in the end.